A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all, depending on where you are. My name is Antoinette Saye. I am Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and former Director of the IMF's African Department. Thank you all for being here today. I am most honored and pleased to open the AFR at 60 conference, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the African Department at the IMF. The conference follows a commemorative event with President Ouattara in 2021 and is accompanied by the issuance of a special Finance and Development online publication. It will discuss two important issues. First, how Africa, the IMF, and the African Department have evolved over the past 60 years. And second, what challenges the region, our institution, the African Department will face in the post-pandemic world. With only 3 African member countries out of the 30 original members of the IMF in 1944, during our institution's early days, the IMF's role in Africa and more generally in developing countries was initially limited. But it has clearly grown over the years. And since the first exceptional loans to Ethiopia in 1948 to 1949, the IMF has supported the region by providing lending, often on concessional terms, with the creation of the Poverty Reduction Facility, the PRGF, in 1999, being a landmark in this respect. We have also supported the region with debt relief, as well as policy advice and capacity development. The African Department was created on April 10, 1961, to assist in the formulation and execution of IMF policies, to advise African member countries on their economic policies, and to inform management and the executive board about relevant economic developments and policies in the region. The department's mandate was expanded to allow consultations with official and private creditors on the financing of economic programs and the rescheduling of external debt. Although these functions have not changed much over time, the region and the fund's relationship with it have continued to evolve in line with the changing economic and political landscape. 60 years ago, many African countries were going through their post-war and decolonization processes, facing adverse circumstances, including extreme poverty and lack of basic health care and education. In the 1970s, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the 2 oil price shocks brought new challenges to the continent, which required difficult adjustments. In the 1980s, debt crises and inflationary spikes spread through much of the emerging and developing world, and Africa was not spared. The 1990s brought other external and capital flow crises to those emerging nations, including the devaluation of the CFA franc in West and Central Africa. The 2000s marked the beginning of the continent's takeoff. As the political situation improved in many countries, national governments began to crack down on corruption and improve governance, and macroeconomic growth plans aimed at improving living conditions began to be implemented. The 2000s were also marked by a favorable external environment, including high commodity prices, the heavily indebted poor countries, or HIPC debt relief initiative, and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, or MDRI, which helped countries reduce their debt levels and support macroeconomic stability. The 2010s continued on that path and also saw the reform of the IMF's framework for providing financial support to low-income countries via the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, or the PRGT. During this period, several countries achieved dramatic improvements in economic growth, poverty reduction, and living standards, including life expectancy and educational attainments, as well as political accountability. Nowadays, the IMF membership includes all 53 African countries, and assistance to Africa has become a major part of the fund's role and budget. The IMF, for its part, has also changed significantly over the years. Indeed, we learned from our past mistakes when providing financial assistance. A key lesson was to listen more attentively, to ensure stronger program ownership, and to streamline conditionality. Through resident representatives, 5 regional technical assistance centers, and a very active African Training Institute, our presence in the field has also substantially strengthened. Such a footprint in the region has allowed close interaction with the authorities and civil society, as well as other stakeholders on the ground, helping to better understand their needs and how to best support them. More recently, the IMF's work has increasingly focused on making growth more inclusive. Attention to inequality, gender, and climate change have become part of the fund's agenda. So it is clear that today's IMF is not your grandfather's IMF. We believe that this evolution has made us more effective in helping country authorities implement policies to underpin stability, raise growth, and improve development outcomes. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to take a heavy human and economic toll on Africa. The fund responded to the crisis by enhancing its financial support and toolkit, quickly expanding concessional financing for LICs with hands and targeted technical assistance, extending debt relief to our most vulnerable members, and providing a financial boost with the SDR allocation to better support the recovery of LICs from the pandemic. Our main worry for the region remains the pandemic, which is still spreading, as the new Omicron variant is reminding us. Vaccination policy is the most important economic policy worldwide, but especially in Africa. But with only about 4.5% of sub-Saharan Africa's population vaccinated, our top priority continues to be ensuring equitable and affordable access to vaccines for the region. The international community needs to come together to ramp up vaccine distribution and deployment. The world needs a fair mechanism to redistribute vaccines from surplus to deficit countries and a fully funded system to accelerate vaccination in poorer countries. Looking ahead, the path to development remains challenging. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, has become more elusive with COVID-19. But I remain optimistic that the region can adapt, alleviate the effects of COVID-19, and come out of this crisis on a path to more inclusive, greener, and smarter recovery. More than ever, the continent needs external financial assistance and transformative reform to unlock its tremendous growth potential and boost prospects for reaching the SDGs. Without a doubt, the IMF and the African Department will deploy our utmost efforts and continue to assist our member countries. Together, we can do it. With these remarks, I'm really very pleased to welcome our outstanding panelists and guests, as well as our moderators for today's event. Our current director of the African Department, Abe Selassie, will moderate the table on the IMF and Africa, 60 years of Africa's development. And my colleague, IMF Deputy Managing Director Bo Lee, will moderate the second roundtable on the perspectives on the future of Africa in a post-pandemic world. So in closing, let me thank all of you for joining this debate and wish a happy 6th anniversary to the African Department. And I'll now give the floor to our African Department Director, Abe. Abe, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, DMD Antoinette Saye. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. For my part, also, I would like to welcome everybody to this celebration of the AFR, as we proudly call the African Department in the IMF, to our 60th anniversary. This conference really is meant to not so much celebrate the department or the institution per se, but really to celebrate the region that we also love so much, and to discuss a little bit how policymakers, civil society members, and all that are interested in the region's development can have a bit of a discussion on how to facilitate the economic growth we need so much to have our place, our rightful place in the global economic order. To that end, we have two roundtables today for discussion. I'm extremely excited to host the first roundtable. We have an illustrious set of panelists, remarkable panelists, as Antoinette called them. They are policymakers, deep development thinkers, and global influencers, both of what's happening in Africa, but also much around the world, and really very important spokespeople for our continent. The four panelists will be with us are first and foremost, in alphabetical order, Mr. Adama Coulibaly, an Ivorian Eastern politician. He is currently Cote d'Ivoire's Minister of Finance and Economy, a post he has held since September 2019. And before that, in previous capacities, he was country director for the UNDP, chief of staff at the Ivorian Ministry of Finance and Economy, and many other illustrious positions. We also have Mr. Donald Kaberuka, Rwandan economist, chairman and managing partner of Southbridge, a Pan-African financial advisory and investment firm. He is co-chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on international displacement. And of course, Don, among his many other responsibilities, also served as the 7th president of the African Development Bank between 2005 and 2015. And before that was Minister of Finance and Economic Planning from 1997 to 2005. Panelist is Mr. Peter Kamelingen, a Ugandan national and currently the Pan-Africa Director of Oxfam. Prior to that, he was the country director at Oxfam Uganda. He has extensive experience in development and humanitarian work across Africa and Asia. Peter has worked with other INGOs at program and policy advisor level, including CARE, UNDP, and ActionAid. Last but not least, my big sister, Ms. Ngozi Oruela. She needs little introduction, but Ngozi is a Nigerian-American economist and international expert par excellence, currently serving as Director General of the World Trade Organization. Her illustrious career includes some 25 years at the World Bank, final capacity managing director. And before that, of course, was 2 times Minister of Finance and Economic Cooperation in Nigeria. 2003 to 2006 and 2000 and 2015, but really this does not even scratch the surface of her manifold contributions to international economic policy making. Ngozi, and Don, Peter, thank you all so much for joining us. Let me start by with asking for people to make some general interventions. And really, maybe with you, Ngozi, by inviting you to say a little bit about what your experience of interacting with Africa Department in your various positions as Minister of Finance in Nigeria, but also, of course, when you were across the street from at the World Bank have been, and any other perspectives you want to give us about the last 50, 60 years of economic development in our beloved continent. Thank you, Ngozi. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Abebe, and it's wonderful to see all of you and my brothers here. So, Abebe, I know why you wanted me to join, because I'm the only woman on this panel. I did everything to try and get out of it because I have zero prepared speech, because we're in a bit of at the WTO for other reasons. So I'm just going to make a few remarks. And, you know, it will be in the nature of anecdotes as I've watched the IMF and the Africa Department evolve from my own experience. And so I'm not covering over the whole 60 years, but I'm going to just take parts of it and try to share with you how I've seen the organization evolve. I heard Antoinette say today's IMF is not your grandfather's IMF. It's not your grandmother's either. It has really changed. But let me start by first congratulating you on this anniversary and the idea of celebrating it. I think it's a fantastic thing, and kudos to you and the department, particularly since the department is now doing so many things differently than the way it was done before. I want to start by sharing with you, in my own country, Nigeria, because it's going to be very pertinent to some of the other things I'll say. The perception of IMF was cemented in 1985, 1986, when President Babangida was the president of Nigeria, and the country underwent the then famous, very difficult structural adjustment program, which between the IMF and the World Bank, which resulted in a series of policy measures that hit hard on the population and forever in their mind, you know, characterize the IMF in a certain way. Of course, you know, the devaluation of the currency at the time, the cuts in the social sectors, you know, when fiscal measures were supposed to be taken. And of course, in those days, there wasn't as much experience with how to do this. And it resulted in cuts in long areas, in health, in education, in those parts of the budget really shouldn't have been cut, because they had long-lasting impact on holding back education, especially higher education. You know, at that time, the orthodoxy in the World Bank and the IMF was that primary education gave by far and away the highest returns. And therefore, if you had to rejig your budget, you know, you put more in primary education and less in higher education. So there were these cuts that were very unpopular in the universities. There were cuts in the health sector. And so the country experienced a very difficult situation. There had been some on-lending to small and medium enterprises, for instance, and when the devaluation hit, they had to bear the foreign exchange, the cost of that. And that again made the IMF and the World Bank not so popular. So this created an image of the IMF in the 80s and 90s that was really one that was not a very good. So I just want you to keep that in your mind, because the IMF has had to live with this image for quite a long time, and the World Bank to some extent, but I think it was worse with the IMF. The next thing I want to share with you with regard to the IMF's image, and again, I'm saying this because of the way so much changed. It comes from the 1996-97 Asian financial crisis. This is not an Africa thing now, but it buttresses the story I'm trying to tell about the IMF's image and how much it has changed. Everybody remembers the iconic photograph of Kamdesu and President Suharto. At that time, I was at the bank. I was country director of East Asia with countries like Malaysia, who were going through the same, you know, from the same financial crisis. And after that image came out, and the image of the IMF as the towering, overbearing, if you will, organization trying to policymakers and presidents to sign on to programs that were not popular, but was felt to be necessary medicine. I had so much trouble in Malaysia with President Mahathir not allowing the IMF to be involved in Malaysia's in solving Malaysia's financial crisis, in putting forward any program that helped. You know, the Malaysians wanted to go their own way, and they wanted to put in capital controls. The IMF was dead set against it. At the time, I happened to, as country director, knowing the economy, that this was not such a bad thing to do. And I almost lost my job because the IMF reported me to the World Bank as a renegade country director who was instigating or fomenting rebellion in Malaysia, not allowing the IMF team to come in. And the World Bank could not possibly have a competence in the kind of macro-fiscal issues that were necessary to get a grip on the situation. Eventually, Joe Stiglitz was our chief economist at the time. He came to my rescue and made sure that, you know, I didn't lose my job by backing the programs that we put forward. And eventually, I persuaded President Mahathir that the IMF must stop coming. I actually told him, if you don't let them in, I'll lose my job. And that's what then brought the IMF in, and we worked together. But again, I'm telling this to just illustrate to you the kind of image that the IMF and to some extent the World Bank were battling with in the 80s and 90s. Then we move forward to the image in a way beginning to change. And this came with the issue of the HIPC, the HIPC program, in which the IMF and the World Bank and the MDRI, the Multilateral Debt Initiative, which when President Wolfensohn came to the bank in 1995, I think that was the beginning of asking questions about the indebtedness of the African countries and what was happening, which is basically we were recycling lending and they were using it to pay off the debt. And so the initiative came that was put in place then and lasted until in fact, beyond the early 2000s, very instrumental in getting 31 African countries out of the debt, should we call it debt distress or debt burdens they were carrying, which was holding back their growth and development. 37 countries benefited, if I remember correctly, from about 100 billion in debt relief, and 31 of those countries were African countries. I actually did some work with a couple of colleagues on the issue of structural adjustment and debt relief and whether this had any impact. And we found, this is a paper that I did with Brahima Coulibaly and Belinda Achibong, looking at the Washington Consensus. And we found that what the IMF and World Bank had achieved through this HIPC and along with the other multilateral development banks that participated and countries as well was monumental, because if you look at the structural adjustment programs and their impact, we took a look at this in the 80s and 90s. We did not see a correlation between those countries that implemented these reforms and you know, economic growth. In fact, economic growth in the 80s and 90s in countries that implemented the structural adjustment reforms relatively flat. Per capita, median per capita income grew about 0.2% in those mid-80s to 90s. But if you look at it after the HIPC years and the forgiveness of the debt, you see a material difference. Median per capita income grew about 1.6% per annum. So this really unleashed the ability of countries from about 2000 to 2019 to really grow and made a material difference. And this is linked to a change in the kind of perception of what the IMF and World Bank, but mainly the IMF stood for. And I'll tell you this, in my own country, Nigeria, was further cemented by the fact that Nigeria had not benefited from the HIPC, but we were able to craft, when I became finance minister the first time in 2003, we had a $30 billion debt, and we were not eligible for it. But we were determined, my brief as finance minister from my president was that I had to get rid of this debt. I just didn't know what to do because we were not eligible. But to cut a long story short, we were able to persuade the IMF and the World Bank to allow us to put in place the policy support instrument, i.e. to have a program of our own without financing, because the Nigerian population had basically voted that they never, till today, they will not act. It's only during this pandemic that that has changed. But for decades, they refused to accept any IMF program at all. We were able to persuade them we could do an IMF program without financing. But the IMF had never done this. So Nigeria, but I say this to say that attitudes and minds were beginning to change at the IMF and World Bank, and we were able to persuade them to allow us to put a program in place, which was even tougher than what the IMF program would have had us do, but without financing. And this became the first ever policy support instrument at IMF. So I hope in IMF history, they will note that Nigeria was the first country, because now it's become a regular part of the arsenal, part of the instruments. With that, we were able to persuade the Paris Club that we were doing the right things, and we got relief, and the entire 30 billion was written off. We got 18 billion completely written off, and we purchased the rest of the debt at 25 cents on the dollar, which was another interesting thing. But with that, you see the perception and the image of the IMF began to change on the continent, because people began to see a difference in terms of their growth, in terms of their development. And, you know, fast forward, so I don't take too much time, the IMF has changed considerably. I think various managing directors that have come after have built on this, learned the lessons, as Antoinette said, that the IMF of my grandfather cannot be the IMF of my mom, you know, or my daughter today. And so when Christine Lagarde came, she built on this, and the IMF became no more and more for caring about poverty issues and caring about the environment, caring about gender, issues that never would have been on the agenda before. And you fast forward to where we are now with Kristalina Georgieva, who has built on this legacy. And we find the IMF on the forefront of cutting-edge issues, not just on issues like climate change and environment, but also on issues of health, the pandemic. It's been amazing for people to see how the IMF has really been at the forefront of fighting this fight of vaccine inequity. The analysis that was done, the seminal analysis about how we can help to solve the problem of vaccine inequity and gender sustainable growth globally. The 50 billion to be invested in order to get vaccinate 40% of people by the end of this year and 70% next year in order to save $9 trillion. That has become part of the legend. So Antoinette said vaccine policy is economic policy, and we say trade policy at the WTO is economic policy. And I really want to say that the difference in the IMF is vast. The speed with which the department reacted, and you know, we were with our baby away to increase disbursements by 13 times almost. The average yearly disbursement, amazing. The debt relief that was put in place, the same thing. And so I think we've got a new IMF, the continent, the 650 billion SDRs, of which 33 billion coming to Africa, was linked to what the Africans were saying, that we don't have the fiscal space. We need debt relief, we also need liquidity, we need additional financing. And this is where we are today. And I just want to say commendations for the exchange we've seen. Congratulations, and keep it that way. Thank you.
Rosie, thank you so much. And of course, you know, it's exactly these kind of brilliant insights and really sweeping and very telling illustration that we want to hear from you. But thank you so much for that attention. So if I may, I will now turn to Sharadama with a question. Gozi has very nicely illustrated, I think, that the IMF has changed some over the years, and you're, of course, an important counterpart to a lot of the work that we do in supporting your policies in Cote d'Ivoire. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see the economic policy challenges at the moment, and in what ways you find the work that we do to support you helpful or otherwise. Thank you, Minister.
Okay, merci, merci.
Thank you, Abe. I think that the base has been launched by Antoinette to show the route that the fund has taken in the last 6 years. And I think Ngozi showed how important actions of IMF is for our continent. For Cote d'Ivoire, I'd say, for starters, the connection between Cote d'Ivoire and FME is a successful model. Successful model because, as you know, Cote d'Ivoire had a post-electoral crisis in 2011. We have overcome the crisis, and we had at the helm Alassane Ouattara, who you know very well because he was a deputy managing director of the fund. So with somebody like that leading the country, I mean, only good things can be made. I think that the best asset that we have in our country is our president, because he knows this institution, he knows how it works. And I have followed our relationship with the IMF as chief of staff, now as minister. I participate in the discussions that are the programs that we negotiated with the IMF. And there's been a change. I noticed there's been a big change in the manner with which the IMF approaches these things. The IMF now takes better into account the concerns of the countries. The IMF listens to the countries that exist and the different countries, and that's very, very important. Another thing I wanted to mention, which is also a factor for the success in our cooperation, is the ownership of the programs that the national institutions have taken. So the institutions have taken ownership of the program, and that makes their implementation easier. Another thing, the IMF listens to the concerns of the countries, and it develops their program, taking into account the capacity the countries have to implement the programs. This is very important. So when I say that we are a model of successful cooperation, I would like to mention that since 2014, Cote d'Ivoire has access to the international capital markets. And this is thanks to the support of the IMF, because the investors, our financial partners, are still interested in the IMF. Therefore, that was a good thing, allowing Cote d'Ivoire to develop it, support its development with access to the capital markets. So now, Cote d'Ivoire is a fast-growing country, and I think we are among countries that have the best performing economies in the world. The grading agencies give us BB minus, which are the best countries in terms of grading by these agencies. Some say that the Cote d'Ivoire is a miracle, and they talk about the second miracle in Cote d'Ivoire because it's very hard to get out of the crisis as bad as the one that we had in the 2010s, and in 10 years to recover such level of performance. Investors, bilateral, multilateral partners, all of them recognize the exceptional achievements of Cote d'Ivoire in 10 years. And I would like to congratulate and thank the IMF for its support, especially during the crisis where money has been disbursed very quickly. And that's very important because the fact that the IMF reacted so quickly, that was like a snowball effect with other partners. Because the others said, well, IMF started so quickly and fast, why shouldn't we do the same thing? So the IMF catalytic effect on other development partners, and IMF is a very important partner for Africa in general, for Cote d'Ivoire in particular. As far as vaccines are concerned, it is very important for us, as Ngozi said, to see the IMF involved in that, to make things change. It's not the IMF of the 80s. I was an economist, economics professor at that time. At that time, we talked about structural adjustment projects with disastrous effects to the population, but the IMF abandoned all that. The IMF of today is an IMF which cares more about issues of poverty, social issues, so that the programs that we develop with the IMF are programs that have a social sensibility, so to speak, to show you what the IMF does today. I don't want to talk too long here, but I just want to say happy birthday, happy anniversary, 60 years, and I want to stop my first intervention. So happy anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister. Very, very helpful intervention. Don, if I may turn to you. Like Ngozi, of course, like Minister Coulibaly, you've dealt with the IMF both as a head of a multilateral entity yourself, but also as Minister of Finance, your counterpart to many IMF teams. At a particularly very important period in Rwanda, when the country was rebuilding itself in the wake of its civil war, and the success that the country has become now was built on the foundations of much of the work that you did in the 90s, in the late 90s and into the 2000s. If you could say a little bit about what were the challenges that you were encountering at the time, macroeconomic policy challenges, economic challenges more broadly, and how your interaction with the IMF helped, if it did, of course. Thank you so much, Don.
Thank you very much, Amro. Thanks, Antoinette. Thanks, colleagues, panelists. You're right. My relationship with the International Monetary Fund is as governor and minister at the time, and later as head of one of the IFIs. So, in minutes, I think Ngozi and Minister Coulibaly have said most of the things I agree with. I just would like to people in this conversation learn a few lessons which I think are pertinent for the future. Let me say, like everyone, the International Monetary Fund has gone through a remarkable transformation. It's unrecognizable from it was in those years. From the instruments, from the advocacy, from the broad interpretation of its mandate, as you can see during this crisis. I mean, the International Monetary Fund has been one organization which in this COVID crisis has shown clearly that when you have leadership, when people are willing to interpret their mandate broadly, you can actually be relevant and responsive. So, congratulations, Joe Golden. Now, it is true, IMF has been a learning organization, highly adaptable, forward-leaning, always exploring new areas like my colleagues have mentioned. Now, I'm not unaware of the criticisms of the 80s or the 90s, which basically says the fund is too prescriptive, it is one size fits all, maybe perhaps even the balance between what you can call structural adjustment and the structural transformation was given the importance it deserved. What our countries needed was obviously a degree of action for things which had gone wrong in the previous years. But what it needed more was actually tools for structural transformation to join the higher levels of global change, which is where wealth comes from. All nations throughout history have been poor at some point. They get out of poverty through trade and access to capital. And therefore, that's why I think there was a debate which seems at the moment be on the way to be resolved. The other one, which I think was a misunderstanding, which you now know very well, was what is the balance between the states and the market at a particular point? It was not an ideological debate of one or the other, but what was the balance? I think we often ended up in a conversation which was not very productive. I agree with Ngozi and Adama that whether it's from the viewpoint of resources, what, where, how, and how much, whether it was from the viewpoint of policy, the fund has become very pragmatic. Capacity and economic governance, very much learning organization. And I do believe the last 5 years, you really have gone out of your way to demonstrate a 21st century multilateral organization, what it can do. But however, I was governor for IMF for Rwanda a long time ago, so I may not have my facts right. I think the current ministers might be able to help a bit more. But what did I learn at the time? Be helpful to the fund. Number one, Rwanda was probably a sui generis for the International Monetary Fund. I doubt that the IMF had ever had to deal with a country A, which has got very strong ownership of what it wants to do. Second, willing to learn from other countries, but at the end of the day, a strong belief in we shall learn our way, we'll generate our own domestic policy space, we'll figure out how to do things with homegrown. I think often this was a challenge for both the fund and ourselves in the sense that the random between the government and the fund, when you begin from the viewpoint, look, I know what I want, but I want you to help me achieve it, was totally different from, I know what you need, and if you agree, here are the resources. So that was a difficult conversation, and I'll give you just a couple of examples, which I think are still relevant today. Number one, it was a very unproductive conversation around what is priority expenditure and what is not priority expenditure. Staff in the fund tend to have a very narrow definition that countries who have gone through debt relief should give more priority to some type of expenditures and not others. So electricity was not a priority. Water was not a priority, all right? Infrastructure was not a priority. The priority was what we call the soft investments. I think a huge misunderstanding, which took time for many African countries to walk over. What I'm saying is the fund also learned through this. We now know that you have to invest in human capital, in your people, education, health, but you also have to provide them with energy, infrastructure, things which provide the basis for future growth and graduation from some of these programs. I think it was an issue which probably took long to resolve unnecessarily. The second, it's around security sector spending. When I now look at what is going on in the Saharan region, in Africa, it is now clear to everyone that a country without the basics of security, physical security, cannot development of its people. And I think there was a tendency to say, look, the right level of security spending is number, 3% of GDP, 10.5% of GDP, never is a function of also what are the security threats and what for the broader achievements for the economy. I hope as you work in the Sahel, in the whole, in many other regions, this lesson has been learned. It is fundamental for the achievements of the missions of the fund. Now, maybe one more thing which Ngozi referred to, I don't know whether I refer to the way it. There was this rather interesting conversation that somehow higher education, the returns to individuals, as opposed to returns to society in higher education, favor the individuals rather than society. And therefore, to find resources in the budget to invest in polytechnics, in technical colleges, universities, the things which rich countries take for granted, was extremely difficult. And I think too that was a misunderstanding which I feel could have been resolved. And finally, social safety nets. You remember the debates about subsidies to education. Yes, of course, we all understand that you have to have the right balance for fiscal reasons. But I think we are not able to begin the process of serious conversation on social safety nets, which now you have, which I really salute, which we now know that inclusive growth begins with actually making sure that you have social safety nets for all, which of course are fiscally sustainable. I do think probably another conversation which I'm happy you're having now was around what is the role of some state institutions when you can clearly demonstrate there is market failure. If there is market failure, whether it is in infrastructure, whether it is in agribusiness, okay, what is the role of the state? How does the state take leadership? Now, Amro, you and I know this debate today. It's no longer as controversial as it was then. But in those days, it tended to be binary and it was not productive. So as we go forward, all I say is these lessons have been learned. But one lesson you can learn from Rwanda is please encourage ownership. Let them take their destiny into their hands. Help them to think through some of the issues they want to do. Let them try out some of their homegrown solutions. Often they work better than those decided in foreign countries. And then as we move forward, this is my last 2 minutes, I think I like what I'm trying to do in terms of returning the continent to growth, because the last 2 years have been remarkable. We have to go back to that growth path. But go to that growth path in a resilient way, resilient to climate, resilient to pandemic, and resilient to who knows what is next. We have also, as you kept saying yourself many times, to find resources to fund this demographic dividend, which will close by 2045. This youth bulge, which we have now, is a huge opportunity for Africa. But it will close on some people who are experts in this around 2050. So we need to find resources for education, for health, for infrastructure in this window where the youth bulge provides Africa the opportunity for the future. How do you do that without accumulating too much debt? How do you do that while growing the tax base? How do you do that at a time when the needs, both for shocks and some of these structural issues are rising? It's something we need to figure out how to work together. And some of the work around this resilience and growth trust, I think, goes in the right direction. And finally, it's about the energy transition and poverty. I think at Glasgow and in the last few weeks, there have been a lot of discussion about what energy transition means for Africa, from the viewpoint of commodity boom, from the viewpoint of countries who have been very dependent on fossil fuels. But for me, the issue, this is a country, this is a continent with massive levels of energy poverty. So in that case, how will this energy transition look like while bringing millions of people who have no access to basics of energy access? It's a hugely important debate. When I see international organizations begin to take decisions, we shall not fund gas, right? We shall not oil, right? In African countries, there is a conversation to be had. So that we don't end up where we are in the 1980s around priority expenditures, non-priority expenditures. African countries fully understand the energy transition is good for them, but there is a sequencing to be done in terms of energy poverty. And finally, very finally, it's about the CFTA. We now have to work in Africa, bearing in mind that what the Africans want to do is exactly what Europeans did from the Treaty of Rome all the way to the Treaty of Lisbon. Closer integration of the economies. It's not easy, it is difficult, but we have to help the continent achieve political objectives. Again, when the Europeans began in 1958 with the Treaty of Rome, who knew they would be where they are today after the Treaty of Lisbon? And along the way, international organizations have helped that movement. And I think it will be a challenge to all of us, can be done. Like you, I'm very optimistic that the recovery from COVID will happen. It won't happen everywhere at the same time. It will be variable. There'll be fits and starts and fits. But I'm confident that doing things in our own countries with the support of organizations like yours, that we can overcome this terrible pandemic and then do the kind of things I've just mentioned. But thank you very much for what you have done in the last 5 years, especially, and also the fund has worked over the last 60 years, especially over the last 25 years. Thank you very much, Amro.
Thank you so much, Don, so much. You've touched on so many issues that, time permitting, hopefully, which we'll unpack a bit. Okay, so let me now turn to Peter. Peter, if I could weigh in. I think one thing that I know, and certainly in my time at the institution, that has changed quite a bit is open and readiness to interact a lot more with civil society in particular, so that we can have more perspectives, more of a sense of how policies are impacting people on the ground. So inviting civil society organizations to fora like this is now, really the norm. Is this something that you've experienced in interactions with our institution, number one? And then number two, I would also be interested in hearing your perspectives on how you see economic governance, political governance having changed on the ground. Being economists, I think many of us on this panel see all the positive outcomes that we've seen in our region as of economic policy choices. But of course, these outcomes are also a function of so many other changes, social, political that take place in our societies. So if you could weigh in a little bit on those issues, please. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Abebe. Thanks, Amro, for that. And I also, thanks for having us here and welcoming Oxfam to this space. It's such an opportunity to meet and hear and interface some of our stronger thought leaders from the continent. And let me also by saying that it's a good thing, and to congratulate IMF as well for this story. It's a good thing to step back and reflect on the years. And I think I will say that I will use this time more to reflect in a way on that history, also taking into account my own experience and the experience of many of us across the continent, the mainstream policy space in any average African country. I think I'm from more the civil society. So I will share this reflection in the hope that it will also continue to guide what I think is now a stated intention for the IMF, for the fund to learn from its history and move forward in a way that it is seen to be a true partner to the continent and also to the people, especially at this time when we are grappling with the many challenges of today in terms of health, economic, and climate inequality crisis that is confronting us. As a way of being humble, let me also be upfront that, there is still, as Sister Nkosi was saying, a very dominant story of IMF is that it is still, especially for what it did or didn't do in the 70s and 80s, still perceived more as the author of policies that exacerbated inequalities in the continent. I think that's true, and I'm glad that there's business both within and outside the fund on that. The whole story around the structural adjustment programs, which many scars, many of which, of course, the continent is still suffering from, and even today. But they are the lasting impacts of this deindustrialization, which of course led to manufacturing decline. The African share of the global manufacturing has declined significantly out of that. And I think thinking of textile industries in Uganda, some of the nascent industries which are actually declined. In fact, heavy reliance that the continent faces today has on China, for example, for basic commodities, and the resultant debt problem facing the continent is in not a minor way, I think, traceable to some of these choices that the countries took. But of course, it's not just about history. Most Africans, including myself, were born and grew up under this fire of austerity. And I'll say something about that. This austerity conditionalities demanded by the IMF in many ways, particularly the issue of reducing wage bill, the spending in general, which has led to reduction of public health workers, and the ability of governments to deal with the health crisis that we are confronted today. Is of course in some ways being repeated at the moment as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the pain of that is manifesting. Now, it is precisely this austerity logic that I really want to come to. I'm really very cognizant, and as Oxfam, we are also joining others to really acknowledge that IMF has begun to change, especially in its discourse, the openness to engage, having spaces such as this one. You have been a very constant, host to very regular quarterly engagements with African civil society across the continent. I think we are grateful for that. And this past year has shown that there's some progress on that, and we're encouraged by the fund's response, especially to the through mobilizing the emergency lending with the little or no conditionalities of the time, and the historic SDR I think that has really is a manifestation of very good progress, and also the insistence by the managing director to tackle inequality as a key challenge to recovery period. I think is something that is positive, and that public pronouncement on inequality is very helpful in engendering this discourse. I think that's something that we acknowledge. But it seems to me, us at least, almost like like a recovering addict. The words are easier to come by in action, and I know that there are many challenges without acknowledging that there are challenges, and this may sound a little bit ungrateful or even tough, but at least at the country level, the words, and particularly now, I think we still see quite a bit of lack of, for lack of a better phrase, a very, very deep addiction to this austerity. And true, as Nkosi has said, there's some progress, but there seems not to be enough honest learning history, as far as I see. I hope that's something that you can reflect on, because at the moment our own data is showing in the next 4 years, 14 West African governments are planning to reduce public spending by 26.8 compared to what it was, for example, last year in 2021. This year, the ending. These countries are among the 30 African countries who received the COVID-19 loans from the IMF as of March 2021, and were advised by the fund. And of course, IMF in average African countries, it's not just advice, it's not an ordinary advice to pursue fiscal policies that fiscal consolidation once the health crisis abates. And there's quite a lot of advice that has gone into this that really push countries to take decisions that actually impact negatively on the poor people. Let me be clear that in the middle of a pandemic, that is problematic as far as we see. We are, of course, in an inflection point, as you said, Bebe. We are in a difficult place, but also for IMF in Africa. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the fund to provide genuine leverage for development in the continent, but also by, I think in my view, I think by relooking at its austerity tendencies, I think, and also, continuing this approach of inclusion, not only with governments, but also bringing in civil society, which I think is something that we acknowledge. We need to see more of that. Secondly, also I think that the IMF needs to ensure that all country programs and policy advice is emphasizing inequality reduction at the center. That needs to be put at the core. But I think this is something that I thought it's good that we have Dr. Nkosi here. I think that the IMF can't continue to be passive in relation to the one key policy issue that is critical at the moment to ending the pandemic and saving millions of lives. I think that's something that I don't want to leave this without mentioning. The fund needs to show it is support for a TRIPS waiver at the WTO, so we can suspend these monopoly life-saving vaccines and treatments. And I think, Dr. Nkosi, Africa will need the WTO to take a more active role to shepherd its membership behind the South African waiver proposal. Africans are feeling the failure of multilateralism at this point in time and are rightly questioning why WTO is allowing itself to be, held hostage by the EU, especially in favor of a TRIPS waiver, including you have the majority of your members supporting, including the US. And I think that we have already had 17 million people dead. So we have to we have an historic opportunity to act for people, but from our continent. And I think that maybe to just touch on lastly what Dr. Kaberuka has this discussion which is underway on the design of the new RSTs. This is key, I think, for Africa. And I agree with you, Kaberuka, that the SDR channeling discussions are happening because of the great needs, but also sheer inequality of how and also SDRs are distributed among the member countries for the IMF. Now, it's important that this new trust embodies the best that the fund has been aspiring for and calling for over the past years, where gender, climate, and economic inequalities are at the heart of the reform agenda in the continent. And so this should not saddle the countries, especially in Africa, with unsustainable debt. I think that is something that is important. I think in terms of lastly, what is happening, it is important to acknowledge that there are things that the fund can do, but there are things that sovereign nations need to do. And African countries, African leaders are not without them. I have to say that because there are a lot of missed opportunities, there are a lot of things that sovereign states within the continent do have. So we do have space also and continue to engage that. And I think that we need to recognize that, especially because we are dealing with relations between states, there's also limitation because the whole agency of citizens in average African countries is still not as strong as it could be. But as you relate with the state, you really know that you are genuinely relating with the rest of citizens. That's why I think that responsibility to expand these spaces so that we are building partnership, yes, with the African states, but most importantly also with the African. I thought that's what I wanted to say in terms of what is shifting, Abebe, Ayemro, for your question on what is changing on governance. Some progress, there's some opportunities, but I think that the whole space for civil society and citizens to engage is evolving. When you are more vulnerable, as it is the case now with COVID-19, it becomes even more difficult to actually aggregate that agency in a way that positively impacts on the policies that governments do.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much for those perspectives. And Peter has put you on the spot a little bit in terms of this issue of the TRIPS waiver for vaccines. So I wonder if you weigh in on that. And more broadly, if I can abuse your time, I know you're delaying another meeting by staying with us. If you could say a little bit about one issue in particular, which is, one of the things that has us quite a bit worried is where growth is going to come from in the coming years. Policy space is constrained. In your capacity as a former Minister of Finance and a brilliant economist, of course, how do you see us launching a strong recovery in our countries? Of course, it's going to be country-specific in many cases, but any areas that we need to tap, you can think of and say a word or two on that also, please, for us. Thank you, Ngozi.
Well, thank you very much. It's a tall order. I was actually smiling because I was about to leave. As you said, I have another meeting waiting for me Peter said all what he said. So Peter, I'll talk very rapidly because I have some ambassadors. I'm really going to leave to talk about the TRIPS waiver. That's why I'm smiling. We are doing everything possible. The WTO is a very complicated organization where you need consensus from 164 members to make a decision. So you can imagine when you have 164 countries, each one is a veto. If one says no, nothing happens. So I think it's a very tough situation. And what I've tried to do since I came, before I came, they were arguing this for a year, is to insert a sense of urgency that we must have an answer because lives are at stake. But I want to put it very much in context. First of all, in small defense of the EU, there are countries that don't get mentioned. The EU is actually one of the more forthcoming ones that is ready to find a way out. You understand? There are many other countries, some of them developing, by the way, who are also not for it, but they're not coming forward. So sometimes when everybody bashes the EU is actually very forthcoming, willing to try and find a way. There are some who are hiding behind. Anyway, that's saying too much, but just for you to get a picture. So what we're doing now, we hope that when we had the ministerial meeting, we could come to a decision, but we have to postpone it due to the Omicron and the shutdown of the African countries from traveling in here. So there's no way we could hold a meeting and have 6 or 7 African countries not participating fully in it. Now, we have not worked, and I'm going there now. We have informal discussions going on because the formal track is stuck, but we're not giving up. We are pushing this, and the informal talks are looking a bit more promising. We might be able to come out, but I want you to be clear that WTO is a negotiating forum. So when you have members at opposite ends, they have to be brought somewhere in the middle. That's what I'm trying to do now, bring them so we can come out sensible solution that will work for us. It means no one is going to get 100% of what they want. I hope we'll come out, and I think we can, with a situation which will allow us access so we can manufacture and get the technology transfer, whilst reassuring those who are against that the incentivization of research and development is not going to be put behind or, sort of suppressed or depressed. So that's what we're trying to get. It will be a reasonable solution, I hope, that all of us will be able to live with. Let me end by saying this. We've been very fixated on IP, but there are 1 or 2 things that we need to be about on the continent that I've said from my previous experience with vaccines. The first is we have to have manufacturing capacity on the continent. Because if you got IP today and you don't have any manufacturing capacity, what will you do with it? So we've actually been fighting a bigger battle behind with the African vaccine task force to get manufacturing capacity. And I'm happy to say that President Kagame in Rwanda, Don is there, with some of our presidents have been President Ramaphosa, President Macky Sall, they've all been fighting. Now we're going to get hopefully something in Rwanda, more in Senegal, Nigeria is doing something, and so on. South Africa is saying we just got a voluntary license agreed. So we need manufacturing capacity. And lastly, we also need free supply chains, because what people don't realize is that even if you have the capacity and the IP, but the goods don't. Remember, some of the WTO members put export restrictions on the flow of inputs for the manufacturing. So even those who had the capacity could not do anything for a period of time. So at the WTO, we also, one of the things that we're focused on is how do we lift the export restrictions? It's even more important. So there are 3 parts of this, and we're working on, but I want to reassure you, Peter, we'll keep pushing. Hopefully by early next year, I'm really pushing for us to have a solution. On the growth story, Pat, this is a big, a very, I think, important discussion. You know, the continent is really still heavily commodities based. And this is no longer going to be the way forward that we're going to develop. And I'm really concerned that the conversation about diversification, adding value to our products, it's not taking root the way that I would like it to. Yes, we all say it, you know, we mouth the words, but I don't really see us diversifying and investing in those areas that I think will be the next to spur our growth. You know, IT services, we've got some countries that are doing well. Kenya, Nigeria is doing well. Ethiopia is coming. We need to really focus on how do we encourage technology and development, digitization on the continent. It's the wave of the future, even for trade. And if we don't support our young people and develop this sector, I think we are going to be left behind. Adding value to our products, that's another source of growth. Services, I know services have been hard hit. We've lost $1.3 trillion from tourism alone worldwide in the pandemic. But we need to look at the service sector. For me, I believe the future of trade is services, it's green, you know, and it's digital. So I think if we look in those areas, green, Don was just talking about the transition. We can't sit behind. He is absolutely right in what he said. We need to be able to convince the world that for us to transition well, we need to rely on gas for a period of time. We need a transition fuel, and we can't disinvest just like that. We need to be able to convert some of those into some other commodities that can enable some of the countries like mine that are oil and gas based to diversify into other types of related chemical products and so on. So in a nutshell, what am I saying? Some sectors, agriculture is one of them all over the continent with potential to add value and to expand. We have commodities, minerals to which we can add more value. We have services that we can develop, and we have IT. We even have the entertainment industry, at least in some of our countries. There's so many areas. It's so exciting, baby. But we're just not having the kind of conversation we need to have. And Don or someone else raised the African continental area. This is our ticket. And it's one of the things we really need to focus on. How do we really get rid of those barriers so we can trade more among ourselves and with the outside? So I've thrown out my 2 cents worth, and I'm quite excited about the prospects. So thank you. Sorry, I have to go to IP.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're fighting the good cause. Thank you so much, Ngozi, for that.
Okay, bye-bye. Yeah.
So if I may turn to you, Minister Coulibaly, next. You know, one point that Peter made that struck me. You know, in all our engagement with ministers of finance, we of course see the tremendous pressure that you're under. On the one hand, you know, you want to try and mobilize more tax revenues, but there's of course quite a lot of resistance from society, from private sector not wanting to pay more taxes. On the other hand, you have pressure, as Peter so articulately put it, also for more development spending on infrastructure, on human capital development. Of course, there's a limit as to how much you can finance this by debt, right? You know, because if you cannot raise taxes, the only alternative is debt. So you're in the middle of this triangle, not being able to raise taxes as much as you want, not being able to spend as much as all of the pressures that you face as Minister of Finance. You know these, and then on the other hand, of course, there's also limits on how much debt can go up. So if you could say a little bit about the challenges that in your position that you face and how you make this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abe. I heard, and I was very interested in what he said. Of course, we need to pay attention to financing and investing on the part. Those are structuring investment, but investments in infrastructure, but also investment on the social. We are under a lot of pressure in terms of financing. In terms of revenue mobilization in Cote d'Ivoire, we've been working with the IMF. We've promoted the issue of digitalization so that we can have more domestic revenue. If we have more domestic revenue, that will, of course, allow us not to contract more debt. Now, if we don't have enough of those resources, we're going to have to borrow more in the market. So I would like to say this. We have appreciated the IMF approach. For a big margin in terms of fiscal deficit. You knew that the countries were facing great difficulties. The countries needed to continue to investing, but we had to also of the sustainability of our debt. So Abe, we are very happy with the satisfaction that you've shown about our fiscal deficit. We are aware of that, but we also commit with you to, and insist on this, to preserve the macroeconomic stability of the country and, of course, our debt sustainability, because if we don't do that, we will not be in a position to finance our development. I would also like to bring up two other questions. One is this, not out of the woods with COVID, but this COVID also shown that international solidarity is very important to fight against such crises. We have talked about vaccines today, but there are also security issues that threaten certain countries, especially in West Africa. In other parts of Africa, yet there are security issues too, and those are important. But should allow for a big manifestation of international solidarity. And I would like to conclude, Abe, talking about the change that we talked about, change of the IMF. We talked so much about this already. The IMF is so different now. And the support of the IMF for the change of the economies in Africa started with the changing of the IMF. Michel Camdessus, yes, he voted with the president of our country at the beginning of that transformation, talking about reinforce the structural adjustment, and that changed. The transformation started that day, and I think now we are getting to the completion of this changing process. But I remember when the transformation started, it's been some time ago. Our president is determined about that. What happened in Cote d'Ivoire in terms of its performance will continue because the president has already indicated that our national development plan that will allow us to transform our economy. And the structural transformation phase about transforming raw materials, and giving abilities to our young people who are through a motor for this transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you very much. Don, if we have a few minutes only left. If I could just hear a little bit from you, please, about this point on energy transition that you raised. How do you see that being tackled? Of course, you know, a lot of countries arguing as gas as an alternative. What is the consequence of international financial institutions not being willing to finance projects, new fossil fuel projects potentially? How do you see that challenge being met? You're muted, Don.
We have two very good objectives. Protection of the planet by a way which is inclusive of the millions of poor people in the world who have access to energy. These are two very good objectives, both of them. They are not in opposition to each other. I'm talking about to sequence them in a way which recognizes that millions of people today are excluded from social and economic development because they have access zero to energy. Now, Africa is full of green energy, so that is not the problem. If today we could figure out a way in which we could increase investments in many of those green forms of energy, all right, this is one of the solutions. But no, it costs $1 million or $2 million for a megawatt of hydropower. You know that from your own country, right? So there are ways in this can be done without having this conversation of no longer invest in gas, don't invest in oil. It just can't happen like that. I think there's an excellent paper by Todd Moss, which you should look at, which shows exactly what kind of problem we're dealing with on energy poverty. It will be the single biggest element of lack of inclusive growth in Africa in the next 20 years. And therefore, as we think about sequencing, phasing out some of these fields, we need at the same time to bear in mind that countries will continue, as Ngozi was saying, to invest in forms of energy, all forms of energy, until we're at a level where that form of poverty has been eliminated. Both of them are good objectives and they are achievable. You know, I put on the same pedestal, as I said a while ago, with the security. And I'm glad that the Minister of Cote d'Ivoire is here. Today, the biggest single challenge of socio-economic development in the Sahelian region will probably be ability of states to deal with security issues. Security from a broad perspective. And there's no way in which you can talk about socio-economic development in the Sahelian belt until we have found ways of enabling states to provide that basic service, which is security for everyone. Now, there are many ways of achieving security, right? From, let's face it, having security organs that function, the military, yes, the military, to socio-economic development, to policies. In my view, this will be equally important. So you have your famous triangle. It is poverty, security, and environment. Whether it's around Lake Chad, whether it is around in the Sahel or in the Horn, these two have to be addressed together. Because some of the internally displaced persons in the Sahel are being internally displaced because of environmental issues. So climate change is real for them. It's a source of poverty. It has to be addressed. But at the same time, they are fleeing because of security challenges from the jihadists. That has to be addressed. And now there's a risk that some of those challenges come to the countries near the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm hoping conversation with the fund and international organizations, we take this next step together. What is it that risks to cause recovery which is unsustainable because either of climate and environment related issues or security related issues or poverty issues? We can't oppose them to each other. They are together.
Thank you so much, Don. Really, really like how you framed this other trilemma between poverty, security, and environment. I'm afraid I've been terrible in our time, and we're we're running over a bit. But Peter, I want to give you the floor for a couple of minutes to comment on the issue of governance and corruption in particular. How do you see this as having evolved the years, and if you know how what role civil society can play in terms of transparency, and how the IMF can help, because I know that that's one of the things that weakens governance and the social contract. So if you could please comment on that in a couple of minutes, and then we need to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Imro, for that, for giving me the chance, and good to see some of the perspectives coming. I think on your question on corruption, I mean, that's a complex question itself. But I think that essentially it's about institutions and also the ability of citizens to affect positively and influence those institutions so that they are safeguards against corruption. It's broadly an issue of governance. I think that one of the things that, and essentially that's about the relationship of citizens and the states. I mean, all countries that have built institutions have crafted a strong relationship between the people and the state. And there are many reasons why that has not happened. If you look at, you would need more a deeper analysis. I think that there's agency, there's stronger partnership because all actors have leverage one way or the other. Even citizens are completely powerless if they are given the space to organize and to engage with the citizens. There's more partnership for us on that, and I think that expanding that scope and including, if you like, I shouldn't be saying, but if it is one of the conditionalities, if there's one that needs to be admissible, it's about really engaging with citizens and providing space for citizens. I thought that's what I could say on that. But I think that maybe while I have this chance, there is also the difficult thing that's happening is that in many of the African countries, there's a corporate capture, the private capture of the state. And there's a very fused relationship between states and big businesses, big corporates. And that makes it extremely difficult to actually do what we want, including some of the fiscal policies. One of the things we have pushed and asked for, that there's actually a scope, coming to your question on fiscal policy constraints, there's actually to be more progressive in tax policy regimes across many countries in the continent, including wealth tax. But that is not going to be possible because there's undue influence, a disproportionate influence of these big corporates over the state in many of the African countries. And I agree. Maybe we just use this chance to refer to what Dr. Nkosi responded to. I agree that the Africa vaccine manufacturing capacity is what is needed. That's why part of the support that we need to be pushing for is also about support to those strategic investments in those areas. I think that needs to be part of the package, aside from the waivers. That needs to be followed with that. Aware that there's a history why these countries are where they are. There's some justice lens to it, including the issues of climate, as Dr. Kaberuka was referring to. There's an element of that. This element that, to be able to invest in renewable energy, to transition in your energy policy frameworks, you need resources. And this is not going to be difficult if you're already poor for reasons that have a history. I thought I should say that for now.
So much, Peter. Very helpful. So I'm afraid we have come to the end of the time allotted for. Really wonderful discussion, a lot of insights, a lot of takeaways for us. We will try and continue to be a learning organization, a learning department. From the bottom of my heart, Peter, Adama Coulibaly, John Kaberuka, and Ngozi, thank you so much for making the time and your wonderful insights. Thank you very much. After a very short break, we will move to our second panel, which will be chaired by our Deputy Director, Boli. That will start in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much all for coming to this event today.